everyone. Thank you for joining National NISLA's office hours, clinical fellowships, and externships. National NISLA's office hours is a live event series designed to bring students and professionals together to talk about topics that are relevant and important to current students. My name is Katie Kingsbury, and I serve as National NISLA's Vice President for Programming and Audiology. I'm a second year AUD student at the University of Iowa, and I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight and my executive council partner, Kennedy.
Thanks, Katie, and hi, everybody. My name is Kennedy Wilkins, and I serve as National NISLA's Vice President for Programming for Speech Language Pathology. I'm a second-year SLP grad student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and like Katie said, I'm going to be monitoring any questions that you ask throughout the night, which should be done through the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar.
Before we get started, we'd like to take a few minutes to thank our wonderful sponsor, SPG Therapy and Education, for their support of this event. I'd like to invite Ms. Jen Lopez from SPG to share a few words. Jen, I think you're muted if you'd like to unmute. No worries.
Oh, I was. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much. As I was saying, I'm really excited to be here supporting this NISLA office hours. SPG Therapy and Education is a California-based non-public agency. We are a multidisciplinary provider that works with clinics as well as schools all throughout the state. We definitely were a clinician-run organization, and so we've all walked in your shoes. We've all been where you are as you start to think about those CF positions or externships, just heading out during that transition from being a student to an early professional. A big part of what we do at SPG is a lot of university outreach, as well as giving back to our local communities and our CSD programs across the United States. So I'm very excited to be here. I've been able to participate in this event before, and so I'm looking forward to a lot of your questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. At National NISLA, we understand that applying and interviewing for CS and externships is a rewarding, but sometimes a long and somewhat difficult process. Between crafting your resume, a cover letter, and preparing for interviews, applicants can sometimes find themselves feeling overwhelmed. National NISLA wanted to offer a way for students in their clinical fellowships and extern application process, or a little before that, to seek advice from professionals who really have firsthand experience. During tonight's office hour, we will hear from CSD related professionals with experience on the hiring side of the application process. And although we have developed questions for the panelists, event is meant to be a really open discussion. So feel free to ask questions via that Q&A feature found in your Zoom bar. So Q&A, not chat. We're going to try to keep those two separate. You can also feel free to add comments though in the chat. We're fortunate to have an amazing panel of professionals who took the time out of their busy schedules to prepare and come help us as we embark on this clinical fellowship and externship application process. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel of professionals: Jennifer Lopez, Deborah Suter, Aaron Miller, Rachel Glade, Kelly Schmidt-Clay, Jody McCullum, and Becky Pitts. Please introduce yourself, including your discipline and place of employment. We can kind of go the order of the slides. So if you see yourself, hop on and introduce yourselves.
Well, you just heard from me, so, but I am an SLP by trade. This is my 25th year of being a practicing SLP, and my current role, I get to do a lot of CF support. I also lead our recruitment team, so I get to do a lot of reviewing of resumes and interviews. So bring all your hiring questions.
And hi, I'm Deborah Suter. I'm director of the Voice and Swallow Clinic at the University of Kentucky, and certainly have been involved in hiring a number of clinical fellows over the years, taking externs from various universities over the years, and previously served as chair of the CFCC. So happy to answer your questions tonight.
Hi there, Rachel Glade here. I'm the program director at the University of Arkansas. I've spent a lot of time with students helping them craft resumes or providing job recommendations, also working with employers too. So very familiar with this side of things, and currently have the great pleasure to serve you all as Vice President for Academic Affairs on the ASHA Board of Directors as well.
Hi, I'm Erin Miller. I'm a professor at the University of Akron, and I'm currently the clinic coordinator for our program, which is a consortium program between Akron and Kent State University. And I'm here really representing the Audiology Clinical Education Network, and hopefully I can bring you some insights on those resources for audiology externships.
Hi, I'm Kelly Schmidt-Clay. I'm the Director of AUD Studies at the University of Iowa, and I've also been helping students for about the past 8 years work and coordinate and obtain their fourth-year outplacements in audiology. So I'm kind of speaking from the mentor side.
Hi, I'm Jody McCullum, and I am an audiologist at Mayo Clinic. I'm a co-director of our education program for audiology here. I'm relatively new in this role. However, I have been at Mayo for 13 years, and part of our process for incoming externs is for all of our audiologists to review incoming applications. So I've really been a part of the process since the beginning of my career here.
And I'm Becky Pitts, also at Mayo Clinic in Arizona, co-director of education. We are both fully clinical, so we're involved, kind of hands-on with all of our externs, and also been with Mayo for about 35 years. So again, been in that supervisory role for a long time. So.
Great, thank you so much. So our first topic for kind of how to research CS and externship opportunities. So kind of that getting started process. We have a few questions to kind of kick things off, but please feel free to start putting your questions in that Q&A feature so we can kind of roll into what you guys are really interested about. So this will be one to start for the whole panel, just to kind of open us up for the evening. So what advice do you have for students as they research places to apply for CS and externships? So first, we'll start with Rachel, if you don't mind.
Sure, happy to. I think when you're researching, obviously you want to be looking for places that are of interest to you, because you certainly don't want to spend a year of your CFY that's in a location or with a population that you're not passionate about. So obviously find something that you're interested in. I think secondly, you want to talk with who your available mentors or supervisors will be at that site and how available will they be for you. Are they going to be able to schedule meetings with you when you need to, or are they willing to accept questions? For lack of a better term, you want to make sure that you gel with whoever your supervisor is going to be, because if you don't, that might make for a negative experience for you and the people you serve. So I would definitely recommend that. And then certainly I would get expectations in writing. What are they expecting of you? What are you expecting of them? Set the tone early for success. That's what I'd recommend.
Awesome, thank you so much. Kelly, would you like to go next? So this is more for the externship side.
Yeah, I always tell students to kind of think of what they want to do long term. Obviously, the first thing is, do you have all your competencies met already? If so, then that opens you up to kind of take any sort of position you're interested in. Maybe you want to focus more on peds or adults, but you have to make sure you have all of your competencies met prior to that. The other thing I always tell students to think about is what you might want to do long term. So if you think that you would like to work at a major medical center, try to get a CF or a outplacement at a major medical center. If you are really interested in working at a VA, try to get some placements ahead of time time at a VA that would prepare you or give you the VA experiences you're looking for, so you're a little bit stronger candidate. So kind of think about it throughout the entire process, but also think about where you see yourself long term, and kind of set your goals towards that.
Awesome. Erin, if you'd like to go next, if you have anything to add.
Sure. I think it's important to have an experience that crosses the scope of practice so that you can continue to maintain those competencies as well if you're looking for positions as you leave that final year externship. The other thing that I think is really important is that when you're applying, that you've already looked at where that placement is and that you can afford to live in that location based on any stipend that might be offered, or any other financial support you might have from family, etc. I think from the clinical position, like when you're that facility, they want to make sure that they're not going to offer a position and then later hear that, well, you actually can't afford to live in New York City. So we have our students do like an assessment of, and they have to provide that to me so I know they have the resources to live in that area. I just think, again, it creates better relationships with our external partners, and they really are a big part of this. The academic programs assist, but our partners in facilities like the Mayo Clinic are important for us to be successful.
Perfect. That's such a great point about maybe some of the things we don't think of outside of clinic. So I'll hand it over then to Deb if you'd like to add anything.
To be very honest, I think Rachel hit on most of what I would talk about as far as looking for clinical placements. I think you really want to do your research into where you're applying, and make sure that you think it's a good fit. I know one of the things that we look for specifically is if students have had a specific clinical placement in an area related to what we do. So being a voice and swallow clinic, if that's what you think you want to do, we really want people who've had those specific experiences. So making sure you set yourself up well for success. But then again, when you're looking for CFs, making sure that you gel, I think is huge. Just getting that gut feeling when you come in. I know on the hiring side, it's huge for me, but it should be also huge for you as well.
Okay, that's such great advice. And then I'll hand it over then to either Becky or Jody if you'd like to speak on this.
Go ahead.
I want to add on to what Erin was saying about location. We are located in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is a pretty high cost of living. We do offer a stipend at our placement, but it's not, enough probably just to survive on that. So considering cost, I think, is really important, but also location on, is the weather there something you can handle? Have you lived in 120 degrees? Are you somebody who needs a support system? Is it going to be hard for you to be away from family and friends? For audiology, it's a year long and it's strenuous and stressful. And are you going to have the support system you need? And the other thing, we have 3 externs here. So we have a little bit of a built-in support system because you're going to have peers you're able to work with. So maybe finding out, are there other, at your site or where you're applying, is it a one extern placement? Is a multiple extern placement? And also, what does that look like for what kind of access to experiences you're going to have in different disciplines?
Yeah. And I might just kind of pivot a little bit and say, sometimes I think at a second year or third year graduate student, you kind of think what you want to do. You kind of feel like this is my first love, but you may not have been exposed to everything within the field. So this to me is kind of a continuation of that discovery time in your career. I feel like sometimes going to a place that offers a nice variety of clinical options so that you can really expose. We've had so many students that have come in and said, yes, I really want to do this. And I've never done any of that. And then they start doing that. And they're like, my goodness, this is my first love now, So I just say kind of think broad spectrum a little bit at this point in the game.
Those are such great pieces of advice. And then we'll round out. Jen, would you like to add anything?
I don't think so. I think everybody has really touched upon all of the main points. I think that and I can't remember, I'm sorry, who said, make sure that you can see yourself there just as much as like that company or that organization can see you there, because it's really, really important for you to gather all of that information. So don't feel intimidated to ask those questions. And when we were talking about weather and things like that, make sure that it is something that you're going to be able to do. So yeah, I think everybody else kind of summarized it perfectly.
Well, this was such a great kind of way to kick off this night and kind of this section. So kind of one of the big questions we see popping out from our audience, we'll split this maybe into two just because the timeline's a little different. We'll start with more CFY side. What's kind of the best time of the year to look, or when should students start really consider applying for their CF? So I'll throw this over to Jen. You kind of got the end of that one. So if you wouldn't mind starting with this one, this would be, I think, a perfect question for you.
Absolutely. I firmly believe that it's never too early to start that process and that search. A lot of organizations will allow you to do informational interviews. Maybe you can kind of talk with somebody who currently is a part of that organization. I saw something in the chat about, messaging somebody on LinkedIn, growing your network in the kind of targeted areas that you're looking at. All of those things can kind of prepare you for those ultimate interviews. Depending on the setting that you're choosing, jobs will either be open by a certain date. You can find that usually on the organization. If it's a hospital or school districts, things like that, you can find that on their individual websites. But I do think if you're looking in private practice or any sort of private company, a lot of times they will interview you early. I've already done interviews for December graduates. I've made several hires now for August graduates. So I do think it's never too early, and but also at the same time, some of that may change. You may have an externship or something coming up that may change your mind. So some of that, even just again, gathering information, I think is a really important thing to do. You don't want to feel rushed at the end, especially if you're going to be moving or you've got financial, restraints around or constraints around, what's going to be coming your way, things like that, family obligations. So I always say plan ahead.
Thank you so much. And then I'd also like, if you wouldn't mind, Rachel, you gave such a great answer in our Q&A feature, kind of somewhat about this. So if you kind of like to expand and also just kind of share with the audience some of your thoughts about what you responded to about applying the kind of the timeline for CFs.
Yeah, I've responded to a few, so I was like, uh-oh, which one did I say what on? For CFs, whenever students, when you have a general idea of when you think you can start a job, I always say like start applying then. Like if you think you can start in June, go ahead and you can start applying now and just let the employer know, hey, I can't start until June. Like just be honest with where you're at in your career. Like most employers, they're fine. Like if they think, okay, I'm looking for someone for this position. Maybe they haven't passed their praxis or comprehensive exam yet, but confident that they will at least. Just be honest. Like you can put that on your resume, anticipated graduation, anticipated pass date, something like that. And employers are happy to know that. And I'm sorry to circle back, but I did think of one thing I thought would be important about the previous question.
Go ahead, share it.
Okay, thanks. And that is when you're searching for CFY locations, also make sure they have the hours you need. If you're wanting to progress through your CFY in a certain amount of time, or you have an anticipated timeline in mind, you're going to want to make sure that your location has the availability of the patients or students or clients to be seen so that you can maintain that timeline, or you need to readjust your internal clock, so to speak, on what your timeline is for finishing up that CFY.
That is such great advice. So that we kind of heard from two SLP side. So now we're going to shift, kind of make sure we're addressing both ends of it because they're a little different, to the externship side of things, so audiology focus. So I'd like to first put this over to Erin, if you wouldn't mind. Speak on kind of the timeline if we're thinking about AUD externships.
Yeah, I start speaking to my second year students. So I'm in a 4-year program. So I will say it's a little bit more challenging to talk about the 3-year because I don't always know that the format is exactly the same, but I can speak probably more specifically to the 4-year program. I start speaking to my students in March about getting materials together, like their resume, CVs, what they need to do to obtain letters of recommendation, etc. And then we want those materials to be submitted and we review them. I review them before they go out, usually in June, because some of those applications start in August, some as early as July. So those are fewer, but it's mostly in August and September when the deadlines are. The ACEN deadline hasn't changed. It's like mid-September again in 2025, and that timeline can be accessed on their website. And I'll put that in the chat here in a moment. And you can access. I see that Asha put up careers at asha.org. I'm assuming they have externships there. I know Here Careers is also a portal that students will use to find externships. And then ACEN has externships. So that's typically when we start this process. And again, 3rd year, I would talk with your clinical directors there because they may have a different timeline for the specifics of when you should start looking.
I think those are some great kind of guidelines as we're thinking through, okay, kind of summer and audiology, that like end of summer, September time period. So that was a great kind of way to kind of frame our thinking for both of those. So kind of shifting back to when we're thinking about somewhat applying and that process of how do we kind of find these companies. We had a student ask, should students reach out to companies that maybe do not have explicit job openings to ask if they would have a CF or accept a CF applicant? So I would put this over to Deb if you wouldn't mind answering.
I would say absolutely yes. I mean, in fact, that's how I got my clinical fellowship position almost 30 years ago. So yes, it's always the worst thing people can tell you is no. It's always worth it to reach out to somebody. It at least gets your name out there. So if they don't have a position immediately, they might be able to consider you in the future. So absolutely yes.
Okay, that is great. I think it's always good to hear from people. Should I be doing this? Kind of where are we thinking? So that's great advice. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add on that, or are we good to move on to the next question? Perfect. Okay, so I saw a couple students ask this in the Q&A as well as in some of our pre-event questions. So first we'll kind of start more on the CF side of things. So a student asked, how could I get maybe the CF, specifically in this student's case, a medical placement with or a more population specific placement they want? Kind of, do you have any tips of when you should apply? Or maybe how could they make themselves stand out in that kind of specific area? So we'll first start, this could go either way. It's good for either way, kind of specific population focus. So we'll first start with SLP, kind of CF side of things. And then I will hand it over to Jen if you wouldn't mind speaking on this.
Absolutely. I think that it depends on where you're looking. So there are going to be some organizations that are really looking for extensive experience. I think of it in California specifically. Medical settings have become slightly harder to obtain because, especially if you haven't had, a couple of different clinical practicums or something in that area. So I think just also inquiring, I think someone else said all they can say is no, right? And I think that's something that you just remember throughout all of this is make sure that you are asking questions, making your connections, building your professional network. I think when I maintained relationships 25 years later with my mentor from my medical-based placement. So, again, trying to kind of build those relationships and inquiring, that's kind of the place I would say start with, especially if you are hoping to shift into that. Sometimes you may have to look at waiting until you are a fully licensed SLP. It just depends on the setting and the need at the moment.
Such a great answer. So now I'm going to throw it over to Becky or Jody, talking about maybe if we're thinking more population specific, or what advice would you have for audiology students or even SLP students as they're trying to navigate a more focused externship or CF? What advice would you give them?
I think, we at our practice here in a medical setting, and I think a lot of medical settings, we're very broad in the disciplines that we offer. And so, trying to make sure the experiences that you're getting in your more local clinical placements are giving you exposure to as much as you can, so that it's not so overwhelming when you come in and have to sort of hit the ground running a little bit more. So I would say just kind of, throw your net as wide as you can as far as trying to get as many experiences as you can as you're applying, and then making sure you're sharing what your experiences have been, so that we can see that you've at least tried, or even, what are your upcoming placements looking like? So not what have you already done, but what is the plan for your next placements? As Erin had said, because it's, your second year, you're already applying, and you've still got another whole year of clinical placements before you're even starting your externship. Do you have an idea of what that is looking like for your third year, and what kind of placements you're going to have?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. I think that was such a great answer, really addressing kind of all the areas of that. So now I'm going to throw it over. Kennedy, do we have any questions from the Q&A box that our participants would like answered?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So we've definitely covered a ton of the Q&A questions, and please, guys, continue to put some in the box. It's really helpful, and especially if our panelists are already answering them, they can answer them live as well as by typing it out. But we're seeing a little bit of questions about, specifically for SLP CFs, what types of opportunities there are for part-time CFs, and then teletherapy CFs, and how grad students should kind of navigate that during the application process. I will get us started by going over to Deb, if you don't mind.
Sure. So right now, many of you all may be familiar with what the rules are for CFCC standards. So if you've started your CF after January 1st, 2023, which I assume many of you, all of you on here that are listening will do, the rule currently is you can complete 25% of your hours towards your CF through teletherapy. So the hours required for a CF are 1,260. So 25% of those currently can be completed by a teletherapy. And then you asked about part-time CFs as well, is that correct? So the general rule of thumb on that is it's a minimum of 5 hours per week that you can count towards your CF if you choose to do that part-time.
Right. I think that's such a very specific. Thank you so much, Deb, for the hours, exactly. And then we also just had a link drop in the chat for the CF certification standards. So be sure to visit that, take a look at it a little deeper. So we had such a great first section. We're gonna kind of shift gears. We also will have more time at the end to kind of wrap up any questions that might pop up. So don't worry if you're like, I had a question, I'm not sure if it's right for the fit for this area. We'll have some time at the end to kind of answer a lot of different questions. So now we're going to kind of switch our gears and hear about what hiring professionals and our mentors are looking for or expecting in our resumes and CVs. Kind of the big kickers. We got to get those ready. So please start putting your questions in the chat, and we'll start with some questions to kick us off. So Kelly, what experiences are you really looking for on a strong resume? And when you're advising students, what are experiences that you're like, you should really highlight this, or maybe kind of some tips in that area?
Well, one of the things that students sometimes think is they have to have their resume down to one page, and that's not true, right? They get that information from the business school often, and it's like, no, you can make it as long as you need to highlight what you have done, right? I like a clean resume. I like one that's easy to navigate. I'm a strong proponent of headers, clinical experiences. Tell me about your clinical experiences. And then besides just listing the site, tell me what you did. What are the experiences you gained in there? And so I know what you've done, but organize your resume towards the position you're trying to get. So if you're trying to get a clinical position with Becky and Jody at the Mayo Clinic, and you are going to be working with, I'm going to say, a lot of adults in Scottsdale, then highlight your adult clinical medical experience. Really hit that hard. If you're looking to do one that's both medical, clinical, and research, make sure you include your research experience really near that clinical experience so the site can find it. But really highlight what you've done that makes you a strong candidate for that site. And your resume may need to be tweaked depending on where you're applying. It's not always a one-size-fits-all resume, so be prepared to have several versions depending on the site you're applying to.
Perfect. Do any of our other panelists want to kind of add what are your kind of top things you're looking for on a resume, or what you recommend students to really have on those resumes?
Yeah, the one thing we've started doing is having our students write their personal mission statement for their fourth year experience. And then as they proceed on to their first professional experience as well. And that is where they can really fine tune it. If they want a pediatric placement, you know, they can fine tune it for that. If they want sort of across the breadth of audiology and lifespan, they can include that. So I think that can help a bit to have that. So we help them craft that mission statement. I agree with Kelly though, I know our students often we used to send them to services on campus who would help them with their resume, and it would come back and it was like a page and a half, and I'd be like, this is never gonna fly. I just really have told them, you know, it's okay if it's 4 or 5 pages. I know it seems like a lot, but that repetitiveness shows the facility that you've done those services for multiple clinical placements, not one, you know, maybe you only have one where you did a lot of CI, but you have multiple ones where you've done hearing aids or diagnostics, and that's what they're looking for. So it's okay to be a little bit repetitive. I used to like when they had more cover letters, so you could, and some facilities still do have cover letters, to really focus on making that very site specific. So, you know, you introduce yourself very briefly, but then say how your skills align with the mission of that particular facility and the experiences that you've had. It is a little harder on the CV, I know, to make that work. And so that's why I like if they will allow a cover letter to be submitted as well. But some sites won't. So you have to be able to sort of go with what that site wants from you when you're applying.
Perfect. Do any of our other panelists want to kind of add something?
I was going to chime in here. So I think sometimes whenever I'm helping students with resumes, they will initially, I don't want to say discount, but not think about all of the experiences that they have had at other sites. So I do think it's important, like, don't just list, okay, I was at this school, right? Like, yes, that's important, but what all did you do at that school? Were you helping with assessments or screenings, or did you see unique cases or unique diagnoses or things like that? All of those are things that are relevant on a resume. You know, even did you participate in IEP meetings, for example, if you're in, you know, a school setting, or IFSP or something like that, if you're in early intervention, you know, those things that you may or may not have even been able to count direct contact time for, but certainly have contributed to you being a great professional or a great clinician. Those things need to be on the resume. Those are valuable.
Perfect. And I think, Jen, were you going to try to speak up? I was like, we got a little Zoom battle going on.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Not a problem. I was just going to say, don't be afraid to have more than one resume. And I think that that's something that's really important, because I've picked up resumes where the person is clearly has been applying to medical based positions. And I'm looking for information around, like, why are they applying to our organization if we don't have those? So don't be afraid to have more than one version. Same thing goes if this is a second career for you and you have had a very full and wonderful, rich life in an HR position. Don't be afraid to have 2 resumes, one that's very forward of your previous work experience, and maybe one that is very much highlighting your clinical work up until this point. Nobody's expecting you as somebody who is an early professional in your career to have 12 years experience being an SLP. You wouldn't be applying and you wouldn't be in this office hours right now. But I think that it can be challenging for those of us who are reviewing resumes to know exactly what it is you're looking for and what skills you bring. Because sometimes we get, 60 seconds to review some of these resumes and things before we're going into talk. And if everything highlighted is about your HR experience, it makes it challenging also for us to know where we're going to go with questions or what it is that you're looking for. So don't be afraid to have more than one version. And because again, you really, and that's very typical. And so just making sure that you also have somebody, reviewing that for you too, so that you can, because it's really your first kind of impression that you're giving.
Perfect. So we've gotten so many good perspectives on that, but now we're going to shift to maybe the opposite. So, what, as hiring professionals and also mentor, do you recommend students do not include on their resume or CV? So, I'm going to first start with Becky or Jody. What are you seeing on resumes that you're like, maybe don't include this? Maybe this is what I'm seeing and I'm not really loving this.
I mean, I think you really don't need to put anything in high school. Your high school experiences in that, I think that's, not stuff that really is that pertinent, unless it's just something,
Some kind of big leadership
yeah,
role or
exactly.
some kind of big
award that you
honor.
got, yeah. But I think for the most part, you can kind of cut it off and just do college and moving forward with that. So,
And I kind of want to touch on what Erin was saying about, we do have a cover letter as part of our, or a personal statement is really what we call it as part of it. And so one of the things that we look for is don't just write out or put in paragraph form your CV. I can see all of that.
yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about you, not just, buttering up what you want about the experience at our site, but add something a little personal to help us get to know who you are, why you're wanting to do what you do, and how our site can help you really facilitate that in your
Right.
career. So just kind of adding a little bit more personal touch to it instead of just very like, well, here's my CV just in a letter form.
Right. What are you passionate about? What are your, what are experiences have led you to that point, and I think that adds maybe something that's not strictly clinical, something that's more personal. So.
Perfect. I love that touch of they really want to get to know you as a person too. So now I'll throw it over to Deb. If you kind of think of anything, is there anything you see on CF resumes that you're like, maybe don't include this, or things that you're like, I wish students knew that this isn't always relevant, or kind of tips that you're like, how can we kind of avoid some of those common mistakes?
Well, I think Becky and Jody hit on the first one, which is I don't need to know about your experiences in high school unless they're really exceptional, leadership sorts of experiences. They're typically not relevant to what we're looking for in a clinical fellow. For us, if you're looking in a very specific medical setting, highlighting those experiences, certainly if you've done, again, we're a medical placement, we're specific in our clinic to voice and swallow. If you've done, for instance, a school placement, list it certainly, but you want to make sure that you really highlight the fact that you have these experiences with these specific patient populations and content areas. So maybe not downplay, but certainly highlight the more relevant aspects of what you've done during your graduate program.
Perfect. I think that's always important. It's like our students have really done a lot, but really kind of trying to understand what is always relevant, maybe at what time is it appropriate for certain things to kind of drop off the resume. And we have put a number of really great resources for both cover letter and CVs, resumes in the chat. So feel free to check those out, because those might be able to direct you a little further on very specific resume questions you might have. So I'll throw it over to Kennedy now. What kind of questions are we seeing from the audience as well?
Yeah, so honestly, kind of a follow-up to what you were saying, Deb. A lot of people in the audience are talking about, I don't really have experience in the specific CF I'm applying for, or I have the soft skills that I got through X, Y, and Z job, and I don't really know how to highlight that on my resume. So just generally, what type of advice on when to know what to put on the resume and what to not, especially if you're applying for a position in which you don't have direct experience for.
Well,
And
I can start because I did try to reach out to somebody on the Q&A that asked about that, because I know it's difficult for students to get placements in medical settings in particular during their graduate programs. So I think making sure if you have done any sort of relevant volunteer experiences, so some of our students, for instance, volunteer to take part in the Parkinson's Disease Association walk, or if they have done, there are opportunities sometimes for students to serve as volunteers in courses on endoscopic evaluation of swallowing or for voice disorders. So the more you can put yourself out there and do those sort of things during your clinical placement or graduate school, sorry, I think that the better off you are in terms of being competitive. Any sort of free continuing education sort of courses that you can find, I would highly recommend taking those, even if you can't count those hours per se towards anything. Showing that you have the initiative to actually learn more about that particular content area, I think shows a lot and says a lot for you moving forward.
Perfect. Do any of our other panelists kind of want to add anything to that before we kind of shift topics? Awesome. We're getting some great answers so far. So kind of building off that CV and resumes, now we'll kind of shift to a bit what both Erin, Becky, and Jody were kind of talking about a bit. Personal statement cover letters, depending on SLP, AUD. So we're going to start now talking about how to write a strong cover letter. So please start putting your questions in the chat about this topic. But kind of first off, so we're thinking about what's kind of making a really strong, a really standout cover letter. I'll first throw this to Jen, if you wouldn't mind. What do you think might make a cover letter stand out? First, we'll kind of start maybe for better for these students.
Yeah, I do think, and somebody asked it in the Q&A and I was trying to answer it, but I do think that it's a great place for you to highlight, somebody mentioned earlier, some of the things that you didn't list on your resume. There was a question about, I took off time to be a mom. And so there's a chunk of time missing. That's a great place to put some of that information. I also really appreciate a cover letter directed towards my company. So they've done their research. They have commented on some of the special interest groups that we offer as a company, or they looked at our mentorship that we have available, and they're commenting specifically on that. So those things very often stand out to me. And the other thing that often stands out is if there's a different company name in that cover letter. So proofread. I can't tell you how many I've gotten that have somebody else's name and company, and I get it on my desk, and it's not to say that I wouldn't necessarily interview you or hire you, but I do always it gives me pause. So I think those are like my highlights for cover letters.
Perfect. So now I'll throw it over to Dr. Pitts and Jody, if you would want to maybe add on kind of more from the personal statement cover letter side for externships.
Yeah, I think, really it is for us, we really like to see that personal touch on it. And I think this is the time where maybe keeping it a little briefer as well, more succinct. So a 4-page resume is okay, maybe not a 4-page personal statement. No. We're reviewing a significant number of applications. So something that can tell us about who you are, where you've come from, why you're pursuing a career in audiology, what you hope to get, what has attracted you to our clinical placement, and as brief and succinct as you can.
Yeah, I would agree. Something you're passionate about, like we talked about. Make it personal and not just a review of your CV or a resume.
Yeah, include if there's somebody who's been influential in your journey. Do you have you read something or seen something or anything that connects you to that placement in some way as well, kind of makes it stand out a little bit.
I love those tips. Those are great. So now I'm going to ask Kennedy, what kind of questions are we seeing from the audience that would be great for the panel?
Yeah, Becky and Jody, you perfectly segued into this. We're having a lot of questions just about general formatting and length. We don't want to write 4 pages, but when there's not specific criteria of how long it should be, how to kind of navigate that situation. So I'm going to get started by pivoting to Rachel and your advice for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on it a little bit. The resume can be a little longer, but again, I mean, no, there's not a hard and fast rule on those personal statements, but I would say probably no more than 2 pages on that personal statement in general. I do think it's important to talk about formatting because, oh goodness, there are all sorts of wonderful templates that you can find, but some things to consider, like we are not interested in hot pink font. Stick with black or blue. I know that seems kind of boring sometimes, but it helps those of us that, like me, that, my eyeballs, I really like to be able to read what you have written. And so think about organizing your information in a very clear way. Like it's nice to label, like this is my education section. This is my professional development section. This is my professional experience section. Having it organized in a way that's easy for me to interpret helps. And so I would encourage you, even after you have your resume or your, personal statement or cover letter written, have somebody that has no idea what you do proofread it and see if it makes sense to them. See if they have a general idea of the type of job that you're going after or what you're trying to convey, because if it doesn't make sense to them, it may not make sense to whoever's trying to hire you either.
That's great advice. Does anyone else have any other kind of suggestions for our participants about maybe formatting? We really touched that page length, which is great, but any other tips about possible formatting when it comes to that, or even kind of how to navigate that if we're not given a lot of guidelines?
Can I make just one strong suggestion?
Absolutely.
If you're going to write a cover letter to somebody at a particular facility, make sure you know what that person's title is. So look them up. In this day of the internet, it's very easy to look up people, and addressing somebody by a proper title goes a long way. So just make sure you've done your homework. It shows that you've done some research and you know who you're talking to.
I would just kind of add to that, Deb, that sometimes these resumes and cover letters are not being evaluated initially by anyone clinical. So you may be having someone in a talent division, an HR department. And so thinking about that too, very often if you're applying to a medical position or even a company, you are uploading your information via your phone or an app. So try to see, how is that going to look when it is scanned into, I mean, not really anybody scans it anymore. That's how old I am, but you know what I mean? When it's being uploaded into these systems, look and see. I mean, I've gotten so many where they've chosen a font where I can't read it after it's gotten into our system. And then I have to have our operations support ask for a digital copy to be included in an email. So, I think kind of going back to we don't need the pink font and things, it needs to be clear. And it also needs to be very much addressed to whoever you're sending it to, because a lot of times there are 2 to 3 other people who are reading this before it gets to anyone with a clinical background.
The other thing that I would add is to make the ask. So I see that sometimes students put a lot of information in the cover letter, but they never finalize it by saying, I really want the opportunity to interview for this position. They need to make the ask so that whoever is reading that cover letter knows they are highly interested. This isn't just, they put this together and they put it together for multiple sites, but they really want to interview.
I think I just want to add, while there isn't a very specific format you should follow, like what size font, what type of font, single space, double space, if that's what we're kind of looking for in answers. But it's also can you write?
It's kind of a sample of your writing skills.
Yeah, does your cover letter flow? Does it make sense? So I think Rachel said, have somebody else read it. Does it make sense? That's part of it. So I think it's less about the specific format other than, perhaps black and blue to make it easy for us to read.
Yeah.
But really just the flow of the letter, and can I get what I need to get in a logical way?
This is all such great advice. I love how we're kind of touching on how can we make this personal, but also how are we really making this specific to our site. So I think Erin, I was like, Erin, you gave us the perfect segue to kind of head into our topic now about interviewing. You said, let's make the ask. I would like to get to an interview. So now we're here. We've gotten to the interview. So one of our final topics of the evening, we're going to discuss how we can really stand out during those interviews. After this, though, we will still have some time to kind of answer any remaining questions. So if you have any questions about interviews, start popping them in that Q&A or any other lingering questions you have for the evening. So first, I'm going to start with Kelly. So kind of thinking about the interview process, what is something you really think makes someone stand out in an interview?
Well, eye contact, professionalism, come dressed for the part. Many of these are done over Zoom, but you are making a first impression. So be dressed professionally for the part. So look prepared, but also I always tell students, practice your answers out loud. You may think you've formulated a really good answer when you're thinking about answers to questions, but there's often a breakdown from your brain until it comes out of your mouth. And if you're somebody that's like, and you're pausing a lot and you're not prepared, that doesn't look good, right? So really practice kind of your answer to yourself in the mirror, making eye contact, being comfortable. The more you practice, the more you prepare, the better you'll come across.
Perfect. I love that answer. So we really have to channel our professional selves. And I'm gonna hand it over to Rachel now. Would you have anything to add about how can our students really make themselves stand out in an interview?
Yeah, I mean, you can Google common interview questions. That's a really great way, because guess what? Guess who else is Googling those questions? The people asking them, right? And so we're going to pick out the questions that are most relevant for our job site or what we're hiring for. But it's a really good, have an idea of how to answer the question of what are your strengths? What are your, weaknesses? Or I much prefer opportunities to improve, right? Or, how do you feel that you can contribute to this job or this employment site? Another one that I think is particularly important and probably more so moving forward is, how do you anticipate you contributing to our organizational culture, right? Do you consider yourself a team player? How so? Tell me about a time you've persevered through something. I mean, these are things that are fairly common and you should have some pretty solid answers for. So I would, definitely recommend that.
Perfect. And then I'm going to see Deb or Janet. Do you have anything you'd like to add on kind of what are things students are doing either to stand out or that you'd really like to see more of students doing to really stand out in your interviews?
Sure. So in addition to some of what Rachel had said about the kind of common interview questions, one of the things that I have found often happens is we will ask students to go through clinical scenarios, or interviewees to go through clinical scenarios with us. So make sure you've brushed up on your knowledge. So if you're going into a medical setting, make sure that you have looked at your notes from your graduate courses and that you're prepared to answer those questions, because that is a very common sort of practice, at least that we do when we interview people for clinical fellowship positions. And also just make sure you've done your homework on the facility. And I think Rachel said, talk about how you can fit in to that particular setting.
Yeah.
Perfect. I think Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I would also add that, you're not expected to have all of the answers in these interviews. So be prepared to highlight some of the areas that you have kind of room for growth in. There are going to be questions that you don't necessarily have the answer to, or there may be a program that you haven't had exposure with, or you may have your externship ended early due to your supervisor's leave of absence or something. So don't shy away from addressing some of those things. I think one of the biggest things we look for in interviews, and I know myself included, is really just how you handle challenging situations, what your critical thinking skills are. And so when somebody, I know there was a question about, do you typically get asked how you handle a situation or how you handled something where you failed or a sense of failure? And it may not be specifically around a failed situation, but it also is just, we are trying to find out how you may handle some of these situations that could be kind of perceived as more difficult. So that's what I really look for. We do that through very often some clinical questions, behavioral type interview style questions. You may not have experienced it, but think about and offer a suggestion that maybe you got to observe your supervisor do, or think about how you may handle that situation. So I think that ASHA and NISLA have great resources with those different types of interview questions, and think about what some of those kind of behavioral style questions and answers may look like.
Perfect. So, oh, Becky and Jody, do you have something you'd
I
like
was
to add?
just going to add that, and we've sort of highlighted this a little bit, that we're not just interviewing you, you're interviewing us as well. You want to make sure we're a good fit for you, that, have come prepared with questions, get more information about the clinical placement, what your day-to-day is going to look like, how many supervisors or preceptors are you going to be working with. This is your opportunity to get those questions in as well. So have your list of questions prepared, and make sure you get an opportunity to ask. And if you don't, if the interview runs shorter or faster than you wanted, then that follow-up email with some of those questions to get those answers that you're looking for. So I think that's really important too. That shows that you're prepared and you're sort of thinking ahead.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I think you guys are like answering so many of these questions we have in our Q&A without even prompting it. I'm like, you guys are basically mind readers. So I'm going to throw it over to Kennedy to see what kind of questions we're getting in our Q&A.
Yeah, Katie, like you were saying, a lot of people have actually been asking, when you get to that point of where the employer asks, do you have any questions for us? And just kind of having something prepared. I know Becky and Jody, you guys covered a little bit of what you think would be a good idea. SLPs, do you have any other suggestions that are maybe different or things just to add?
I mean, I guess just in general, you're probably going to want to know things like, how do you accrue vacation time, or what does that look like? You're probably going to want to know about benefits. If there are productivity requirements at your site, especially if it's a medical placement, you're probably going to want to know what that is. What are expectations for working on holidays and things like that? These are some questions that you're going to want to probably have at the ready, for your interview.
The other thing I would make sure that you would ask is if there's any sort of financial support for continuing education opportunities, and if your facility supports you being able to take time off to explore those opportunities.
Yes, and same for volunteering or leadership opportunities in your field. Like if you have a desire to serve your state association, or maybe a committee or something on ASHA or something like that, will your employer support that?
Those are such great things we highlighted right there. And I feel like we've hit on a lot of good areas of different things students are asking about. And we've had so many good, like positive, like what should we do? But maybe kind of thinking about what are things you would recommend students avoid doing in that interview process. So I'll throw it over to Erin if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, I usually think these first interviews, and certainly for externships, if we're talking about externships in particular, the student should not be asking about the stipend at that point unless that information is offered to them by the site, because they're going to find that out when they make the offer. And, I know that that's a critical piece for some of them, but I would say most of the sites are pretty good about being very upfront about that, even in the materials when they're posting the position. If it's not posted, hopefully they are going to mention that. They usually do. But I do feel that it sets a little bit bit of a different tone because ours is a little different than the CF. You are still a student during this final year externship. So it's very different than being, in the process of being licensed. So I want this and students to appreciate that this is still their educational experience and not an employment position. And I think that changes the dynamic a little bit when that comes up like right away. I'd be interested to see if Becky and Jody agree or if they think it would be okay to ask, because they're on the clinical side, right? So I think it would be interesting.
No,
They
we would
might have a
agree with
different
you.
perspective.
Yeah, we'd agree with you. Rarely do we have we had an interview where they've asked those questions. I mean, everything is posted on our website, so they have access to that information. So
Yeah.
Can I add to that? If that is really important to the student, I will offer to vet that question and I'll just make it very broad. We have students who are interested. I'd like to gain more information about your site. Do you offer a stipend, for example? And I kind of collect that and share it with the student so the student doesn't really have to vet that awkward question.
I would say that's a really good point, Kelly, is that within, at least for the AUD program, there should be somebody coordinating these positions. And you should be depending on that faculty member. You are still paying tuition during the externship year. And so therefore they're there to support you. You don't have to, and there were some questions about this, like, should you reach out to facilities? I actually recommend that students don't do that. If they want to pursue a potential site that's not listed, then if they reach out to me, I will contact the facility and ask them if they would be interested in taking an extern. I think when they get multiple emails from students, they start to like close themselves off and don't even want to respond. But when they see it's a serious inquiry from the program, they're more apt to respond appropriately and positively, even if they don't have a position. Sometimes they just want to learn about what it would be like to have a position. They don't even know yet. So use your programs. They're there to support you.
Perfect. I love we have so many good perspectives on this panel of how we're working together, both educationally and then professionally. So I'm going to see Kennedy, what kind of questions do we have from the audience?
Yes, you guys have been answering and giving such great insight. We've been getting a few questions about red flags, specifically during the interview process, what things students should look out for that may be perceived as a red flag and or vice versa. So if anyone wants to get us started, maybe Deb.
I just typed a quick answer to that in the Q&A. I think one of the kind of the general rule of thumb that I tell people is if it sounds too good to be true, you need to question it. So for instance, if you're being offered a salary that far exceeds what your peers are being offered, you might want to know why that is. So are there really exorbitant productivity expectations? Those sort of things. I think another thing you really want to know is how available to you is your clinical supervisor or your CF supervisor going to be? Is that person on site with you? Or are they, going to be quite a distance, and is it going to be really difficult to get in touch with them? Because you're a clinical fellow, if we're talking about somebody who's just graduated, we don't always expect you to be fully independent, and you certainly want to know that there's going to be somebody there to support you along the way. So those would be things that I would look for, definitely.
And I would add, I have talked to several people looking for CF positions, and they will receive a verbal offer or even in a text message. And when I have asked them, like, or I've told them, you might want to request something written in an email so that you know that this is what you're actually signing up for. They haven't been able to provide that. And so I always say that's a big red flag to folks is if you're being promised things on the phone, but they can't follow up with an actual written offer. And I see this with a lot of, non-public agencies or contracting companies. Again, I always caution, you want to make sure that you are very, really requesting that written information so you can make a good decision for you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So Kennedy, do we have any other questions out there kind of about this interview process or even this kind of process of what are we looking for in some of these final stages?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question that's what is the biggest indicator that an interviewee is the best fit for the role, whether it be experience, confidence, curiosity, and or personality? To get us started, I'm going to pivot over to Jen.
That's a great question. I think it's kind of a combination. I think I love somebody who is really curious. I review everybody who's interviewed at SPG. I review what we have as far as interviewer impressions. And for the people that write things like, they may seem like they may have something in there about like strong background, but also they may have something in there too that says, really inquisitive, asked great questions, excited about learning X, Y, or Z, prioritizing mentorship. So for us at our company, we really look for those things. I think that part of this process is not only just kind of checking off the list of things of like, yes, you had this experience and you had this practicum, but also can you see yourself within that company culture, and can we see you within our company culture? So I love to see, the people who are curious, who do want to prioritize support and continued learning. Those always really kind of come to the top of the list or the pile for me.
That was a great answer. Thank you. Would anybody else kind of want to jump in on that?
Think I'd just add in that again, I don't think it's just one thing. I think we're looking at, how comfortable are you in the interview? We're in a generation of students who are applying for positions who have spent most of their lives with a camera in front of them. So you should probably be more comfortable than we are, frankly, but I'm just looking at your body language. How comfortable are you how confident are you in answers? How, frank are you if you're not sure about how to answer something? And that, I'm not sure about that, or I haven't had experience with that. I would need to think about it more. But I think it's really looking at a lot more than just one particular thing. And so I don't think that there's an easy way to answer this question.
Yeah, we look at the whole person. And I think somebody said this, we're trying to really find the fit that's going to be great for our clinic. We have a pretty fast-paced clinic where all of our disciplines are pretty, pretty busy. So we want someone that's going to be able to kind of, get trained and taught and is motivated to learn and to keep up with that pace. So we look at the whole person and how it's going to fit in our staff too.
Yeah, I love that answer. I mean, we talk about patient-centered care all the time, and that also goes for employers, right? So speaking of that, outside of the schools, outside of your internship experiences, how would you best recommend that an applicant prepare for standing out in their clinical fellowship or externship interview? I'm going to pivot over to Erin for this one.
I'll sometimes have them use some of their other experiences that aren't directly related to clinic, but can relate to that type of team building or other experiences that are going to help them in that situation. So if they've been on sports, or even if they've worked their whole way through school, which I think, for many of our students, they have to, but they've had experiences, working in the public, and to utilize that as well, those life experiences to help them when they're interviewing.
Might just add things like being in the military, or have you been a TA during your graduate studies, or maybe you hold an audiology assistant certificate, and so those kinds of things are super valuable.
Awesome. I love that highlighting how are these students bringing, I think so much as students we focus on, I'm not getting like the clinical placement I want, or really stressing about that. It's like also taking some of that onto ourselves of like, what can I do outside of that to really highlight myself as a well-rounded person, as a well-rounded clinician, because there really are so many other areas that attend well to SLP and AUD and how we're really serving people. So we're going to kind of shift into our last section now for the evening. This is kind of an open question. So if you have any questions that you didn't feel like fit into the other areas, or you just are left with now kind of unresolved questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A and we'll kind of start working through those. So to start us off, we've talked a bit about kind of having a good relationship with your supervisor, but how do you recommend students either starting the externship or CF process to convey what they expect from a supervisor? So I will start this with Deb.
I will tell you what has worked best for me, having just completed working with a clinical fellow. She was very much able to explicitly state the sort of feedback that she wanted. So she wanted direct feedback. She was very specific in what she needed from me, and that really helped open the lines of communication. So understanding what works best for your communication style, understanding how you accept feedback, and being able to convey that with your supervisor, I think goes a long, long way.
I love that. Is there anyone else who'd like to kind of speak on this kind of relationship developing between yourself and your supervisor? And maybe how is it similar to some of the placements you've had? Maybe how is it a little different?
Yeah, we have an expectations form that we have the students complete with their clinical preceptors, and we ask them to meet with them, and we start this when they start any of their outside community placements. We ask them to meet with them for at least 20 minutes. Like it's not a long, it doesn't need to be a long time, but they talk about feedback, communication, what time do they expect them to show up, and not just, well, we start clinic at 8:30. No, we start clinic at 8:30, but we expect that our externs are here at 8 o'clock or earlier, right? So I want explicit information explained, because those are the kinds of miscommunications where I think sometimes you try to keep it casual because you don't want to make it so uptight, but then it results in problems down the road. So I think having that formal opportunity from the outset where you find out like how you're going to communicate with one another, when they're going to receive feedback, is that feedback going to be in written format? Is it going to be orally? Is it more casual? And they have that exchange. I think that's extremely helpful. And I will say, when we started doing this, we have seen less issues in all of our clinical placements. And I'm talking about from, the first year of the program through the fourth year. So I think spending that time, and if you don't have that form, you can still do those same things. Just ask for a bit of a meeting when you first start, or if you have different rotations, because I'm sure at like Mayo, you have multiple different rotations where they're dealing with different preceptors. Have that little appointment with them at the start of that rotation. So, because now you're working with different clinical preceptors. I think they're willing to spend the time because they know it will result in better communication and better experience for everybody if they spend that little bit of time ahead of the
Perfect. I think that's, oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
Go
I was
ahead,
just say,
Rachel.
I'd love to add that number one, I absolutely agree about get it in writing, get expectations in writing. The other thing, especially on the CF side, and I've posted the link a couple of times, and I think you all have, but Asha has that guide to the clinical fellowship experience website that has the link to the clinical fellowship skills inventory. As well as the clinical fellowship experience. But you could even go through that skills inventory before you ever really get started with your supervisor and say, if you have any questions on how can I demonstrate this, can you give me an example of how would I show that I, exceed expectations or meet expectations for these specific skills? If there's anything you have questions about, talk about that on the front end. That way that you know how to start working toward that as you go through your clinical fellowship experience. And again, get it in writing. I just can't put things in writing. It may seem like a little bit weird, but you're advocating for yourself, but also being transparent with your supervisor, and that'll be very helpful in the end.
Okay, this is such an amazing discussion. I love how we're really get that in writing, emphasizing that's so important. I think sometimes we're really trusting, but trying to get that clear communication just to avoid issues down the road. I'm gonna throw it to Kennedy. I think we saw a couple questions rolling in. So Kennedy, what kind of questions are we seeing right now?
Yeah, so taking a few steps back, you guys are talking about, creating those relationships once you're actually in your externships or your CF. We have a lot of people asking about the relationships and mentors that you have prior and how to ask for those letters of recommendation, and or, just having those points of reference. And so I think it'd be great to kind of cover how you would recommend going about asking for letters of rec. And I'm going to get us started with Kelly on that one.
I don't do clinical supervision, but I had a colleague once say that students are writing their own letter of recommendation with their performance in clinic and how they interact with their supervisor. And all the supervisor is doing is putting these experiences on paper. So really, the student needs to realize from the beginning that everything they do is a reflection of them. And so be bringing their best self to clinic and their clinical experiences every day makes for a really good student supervisor relationship. And it makes it easy to write you a strong letter of recommendation. So I think asking your supervisor after you've had some time with them, and hopefully it's been a positive experience, and just saying that I've really valued the time with you. I've learned a lot from you. And would you be comfortable writing me a letter of recommendation? And if I'm not comfortable writing somebody a good letter, I need to also be honest with them and say, I might not be the best person to write you that letter. And so kind of having that open communication, but students need to know that they're kind of in control of what goes into that letter, because their behavior and their performance, all we're doing is documenting it and putting in a letter for them, but they really need to take ownership of that.
I love that. It's like, how are we controlling that narrative as the students? Do any of the other panelists kind of want to add to this at all about letter of recommendations? Anything you'd like to speak to, either in receiving letters of recommendation or in writing them for students?
I'll add that as an employer, I think especially with who interviews a lot of folks for CF positions, I appreciate letters of recommendation, but I also really like a combination of a reference as well as a letter of recommendation. I think many letters of recommendations that come from university professors look very similar. And I think that's wonderful. And that is absolutely a big piece of your portfolio. But somebody who, maybe it was a clinic supervisor from one of your externships, maybe it was somebody who you used to work at a summer camp for, AAC summer camp every summer, and you have somebody from that. I really like to hear, again, kind of going back to that human aspect of it, is that very often we're reading so many of the letters that really highlight a lot of your education and your skills in that setting. But I like to hear from somebody who can talk to me a little bit about like the day-to-day. How do you manage your time? How are you with organization? I remember talking with a reference, and they were talking to me about, this person was absolutely wonderful. Every parent loved them. And some of the feedback, there were some notes about like maybe they didn't have as much experience in IEPs or in parent conferences. But what I saw and what I loved was like, she really got to know and be a part of these different families' lives. And like that was something that the supervisor could not stress enough, was how wonderful they were with clients, which definitely outweighed the fact that they hadn't, learned the online IEP system or something like that. So I like a combination. So if you don't have all those letters, but you do have references to share, I think that's very appropriate and honestly welcomed.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Rachel. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're
I was
good.
just
We're
going
just
to
cutting
add
each
that
other
when
off.
I was just going to add that when you're making the ask for someone to, so number one, with a lot of the speech pathology jobs on the CF side, oftentimes I don't see a ton of requests for letters. There are some, but a lot of times the request is references on that side. But what I would mention is when you're making that request for someone to write you a letter of recommendation, it's okay for you to mention some things that you would like for them to speak to. Especially if that job posting has like specific skills or something like that, and you want to align, like, I would love for you to speak to, to my organizational skills, or, hey, remember I started that database for us, or whatever it was. It's okay to maybe list that out and help remind that supervisor or whomever that is that's going to be writing your letter, like, these are some things I would love for you to mention. If your resume is ready to go, like, go ahead and shoot them your most updated resume, because there may be some things that they want to highlight on that for you. Like, make it as easy as possible for the person that's writing that letter to, sing your praises, so to speak.
Perfect. I think that's such a great way to highlight what can we as students do in that process of how can we make it a little easier? How can we sometimes streamline it? And also in that sense, both of us get out what's beneficial. Because I think students or even sometimes people writing our letters are like, I don't really know what kind of skills they're looking for us to highlight. So that is great advice, Rachel. So Kennedy, I'm going to throw it over to you to see if we have any final questions.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of a technical question. Quite a few people on the SLP side are asking about, as far as CFY goes, what entails meeting those hour requirements. Is it billing, planning, treatment, evaluation? What all comprises that component? And I'm going to also pivot this to Deb just because of your work on the CFCC.
So I can tell you what the standards say, which is 80% of your time needs to be involved in direct clinical contact with the patient towards those 1,260 hours. So the additional 20% can be, documentation, meeting with families, preparing for therapy sessions, but 80% needs to be one-on-one with your patients or clients.
I'll just add that it's important to make sure that you're also looking at your individual state requirements. So every state has a different set of requirements for that state licensure, and sometimes they are much more specific. I can speak to California, that we really try to follow the guidelines around the state licensure because they are very much more specific and have many more hours required for supervision than ASHA. So if you get one, you get the other. So it's always a good idea. ASHA has a really great list that you can access with links to the individual state boards. So you can kind of get what those requirements are, because most likely you're going to be kind of getting that dual state licensure as well as your C's through ASHA, but making sure that you know the different pieces. Like I know Deb mentioned earlier, 25% can be in a teletherapy position, although California hasn't caught up to that yet. So we don't see some of that teletherapy piece for our CF. So it is very much kind of on a state by state basis. So I always say, just make sure you know kind of where to look for some of that individual state information.
And just on the audiology side, I would say for the externships that at least this is feedback that I've received from the clinical facilities. Their preference is, at least if they have 3 letters of rec, and a lot of them have different numbers, that at least 2 of those 3 are from clinical placements. So they have a direct information about how they interacted in those facilities. And then, they could have one from a faculty member that maybe can speak to other qualities that they have. Some are very specific. Like I've had a few sites where they want a letter that's from a previous employer, not audiology related, because they want to look at some of those other soft skills and so forth, or somebody they've worked with. It could be a coach or just somebody else in their life other than audiology. So you do need to pay attention to that, but I think the focus for most of the sites is to see how are you working in that clinical environment, not just that you're, a strong academic student. That's great, but they want to know your clinical abilities as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering that, Erin. And looking outside of the actual meeting, the hours requirement, a lot of students are having questions about what that supervision will kind of look like. And I get it might be a little different dependent on the specific site you are, but I was hoping that some of you guys could speak to what your externship or CF supervision and mentorship looks like. And I'm thinking maybe Becky and Jody can get us started.
Yeah, it's different for audiology externship versus I think SLP CFY. As Erin had mentioned earlier, you're still a student when you are doing your externship for audiology. So, it requires direct supervision. And while we do have ways to facilitate independence, you are always going to have a preceptor with you for every appointment who you're, discussing your patients before, during, after. So it's a lot of really direct supervision and a lot of immediate feedback and long-term feedback. And it's probably a very different setup. So I think supervision is heavy for audiology.
Yeah. And in our clinic, we have, although we're directors of education, we have 10 other preceptors that are actually interacting with students on a daily basis. So there's, we always say kind of keep an open mind, and they're going to have different styles and that. So just precepting is very, although we kind of are the, directing it, there's a lot of other hands in the pot too in shaping that student. So.
Awesome. Does anyone else kind of want to speak to this? Or we've kind of touched on supervision a bit, but either Jen, Deb, do you feel like there's anything you could add to this about kind of that supervisor relationship or some of those expectations?
I mean, I do think we've kind of touched upon this, but I do think that really asking in the interview process, like who will be your supervisor? How is that going to be determined? What does supervision look like for you? We on the hiring side, I get people who have left a current CF experience because they're 4 months in and they've only seen their supervisor one time, and it was on a Zoom. And so asking those questions, making sure that if possible, can you set up a time to chat with that person prior to beginning? Could you talk to somebody else who has been supervised by that person? Ask some of those questions. Again, I think the theme is all they can do is say, no, not at this time, but it cannot hurt to ask. And a lot of times you will get a yes on that. So, I do think that information is really, really valuable. Because that really makes or breaks your feelings during that first year, as well as just, somebody had questions about dealing with burnout and reading stories about how burned out SLPs are. And I find that those things really do come from a feeling of a lack of support and not having that community, more so than, yes, the workload ebbs and flows. And there are times when you're going to have a lot more work and assessments and things like that. But when you feel support and you have that community, I always talk about, find your speechies, find those groups of people that can, share ideas with and things. But I do think that is one of the biggest things that can really set the tone for years to come.
Awesome. I love that so much, Jen. And I think that's like the perfect way to end this evening, that idea of community. So finding your people, finding your connections. This field's small. You might run into them at the ASH convention, AAA, you never know. So that's always a great thing to be thinking about. So I just want to say a big thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you all feel a little more empowered and prepared to enter this exciting next step to becoming either a speech language pathologist or audiologist. Our panelists have generously offered to share their contact information in case you'd like to follow up with any of them individually. So we'll post that information in just a moment. We're also about to post 2 important links in the chat. One is a quick survey, so you can give us feedback about this event and maybe how we can make it better. The other is a special link to our NISLA blog, which will show you all the posts we have related to CFs, as well as the externship application process. So now that we've kind of wrapped up this evening, here is a quick look at National NISLA's remaining spring virtual events. We have a number of great events coming up, so please see our virtual events page to learn a bit more. The 2025 ASHA Virtual Career Fair is going to include 2 spring events, March 12th for audiology and April 9th for speech language pathology. And more information will be available at the link posted in the chat. And then both the registrations for audiology and SLP are both being posted.
Also, we just wanted to mention that our National NISLA Honors Program is open right now, and it is one of the many benefits of being a National NISLA member. Apply to be recognized yourself or recognize a peer or advisor. And remember that if you are in the class of 2025 or 2026, holding a 2025 National NISLA membership is necessary for NISLA to ASHA conversion discount. And you get so many benefits for being a part of our team.
On behalf of National NISLA, we'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists for offering their time and expertise. If you'd like to connect with any of them, or myself or Kennedy, feel free to screenshot this slide. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, SPG Therapy and Education, for supporting this wonderful event. This has been such a great discussion, and we'd appreciate your feedback. And it's only with the help of our dedicated members that the CSD community continues to thrive. This conversation has been recorded and will be posted on National NISLA social media accounts. Thank you all and have a great night.